Hi everyone. שלום, אני אתחיל את האירוע הזה בעברית. Karen, I'm just gonna do an intro in Hebrew. שלום לכולם, היי, ברוכים הבאים ל-Q&A שאלות ותשובות עם קארין לוואצ'י, שנמצאת כאן איתי. תודה רבה לכולם שבאתם, וזה האירוע שבו בעצם אתם שואלים את השאלות. מי מכם שאולי היה באירוע של 7, שבו אני שאלתי את קארין את כל השאלות והיא ענתה, אתם מוזמנים לשאול שאלות המשך, שאלות המשך לתשובות שהיא נתנה, או בכלל דברים שעולים לכם, ותכתבו את השאלות, יש קופסה מתחת, יש כאילו את המקום שבו אתם רואים אותנו, ויש ליד זה את הצ'אט שבו אתם מוזמנים לדבר בין עצמכם, ויש קופסה נפרדת מתחת לאיפה שאתם רואים את הפרצוף שלי כרגע, שנקראת שאלות למרצה, ושם אתם מוזמנים לכתוב את השאלות לקארין, והצוות הטכני הנפלא שלנו, של רוני וברק, הם יעבירו לי את השאלות, ואני אתרגם ואשאל את קארין. אז בעצם כל האירוע הזה הוא שלכם ובשבילכם. אני אספתי קצת שאלות מראש, מכל מיני אנשים, בכל מיני קבוצות. זהו, ואני עכשיו מתחיל את האירוע, and thanks for being with us. So for those who don't know me, I'm Marina Berlin. I am an author and a media critic, and here with me is Karen Lowachy, the amazing author of War Child and Burn Dive and many other novels. In Hebrew, War Child and Burn Dive are, of course, ילד מלחמה וצלילה חופשית. Karen, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and what you're up to and stuff like that?
Hi, everyone. I'm here in Toronto in winter, dead of winter, snowy. And I'm so happy to be here. I wish I could see everyone physically, but you can see me, so I guess that's okay. As Marina said, I've written 4 novels. 3 of them are in this science fiction universe. I've also recently put out a collection of stories that are from the War Child universe and feature different points of view of the different characters, some of the secondary characters, and it spans the universe a little bit more, and also takes it timeline-wise a bit past where the 3rd book ended. And there's a setup, and there's also a preview, the first chapter of the 4th book, which is turning out to be like a short novel, is in the collection. And I'm also in the midst of writing The War Boy, which is the sequel to all of that and returns to Joss's point of view. And I'm also working a bunch of other projects. I write short stories, I write poetry sometimes, and I do film review for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. So that's me.
Okay, so we have your first question. So this is from your Hebrew translator, Inbal. I don't know if I think you've had a chance to interact with her a little bit. Okay, so she asks, have you had many interactions with translators, and did they raise the same questions?
Oh, good question. I have actually a little bit with different stories and with the novels, actually. And it's so cool. They ask very specific questions that I wouldn't think. Like I think for the Hebrew translation, I got an email from that person who wanted to know how to translate Cairo, because it's a name, but it's also the name of the city. And I guess there's a different way to translate it depending on that. And I thought that was cool, you know, and I said, well, yeah, it's his name. So it won't be referring to the city. It should be kind of like a personal proper name. That's just one of the things. And it's really interesting to see like concepts too, I guess the neologisms that I created, like burn dive or whatever, how to translate that. The books have also been translated into French and Japanese. So I know one of my close friends is Japanese, and she can read it. So she was saying how the titles translate even. And some of the concepts and the names in the book, she was telling me how it differs a little bit, you know. So I've always been interested on how translations are done, because one of my favorite authors is Murakami, so he's Japanese, and I wonder sometimes how, if I was fluent in Japanese, if I read it in Japanese, what the experience would be, what the difference would be. I read, you know, poetry from international poets and stuff. So I'm always curious as to really how do you translate not just the literal, I know it's not just the literal words too. The translators are concerned with getting the right feeling or emotion to something. So it's not transliteration, right? Where you're just translating the literal letters or whatever, that it's different. And that's always fascinated me, and I find it curious and interesting because the cultures interpret things differently. Like I'm sure I'm missing stuff in some of Murakami's work because I'm not Japanese. And so there's stuff that's intrinsic to Japanese culture that they try and translate or try and show in his work for English readers or whatever that I probably miss. And from talking, because you know, all of my closest friends, most of my closest friends are from different cultures. They're different parts of Asia, so, and they're bilingual. So I even know just from growing up with them that there's certain concepts in their culture that doesn't translate quite to English, and I always found that really interesting.
Okay, that's very cool. That definitely makes me think of how in Hebrew, like I've read the books in Hebrew, and it is, I've never thought about the fact that, you know, Cairo is not translated to the city, but like is actually just a transliteration of his name. That's very cool. Okay, so the next question. So you've written a lot of stories in the War Child universe. I will also say that you also wrote Ozymandias, which was recently translated and is available in Hebrew for free online at the website of the Israeli Association of Science Fiction and Fantasy. So which minor character is your favorite one to write in focus for like short stories?
Probably Cairo and Eric. I think because they're so easy for me for whatever reason. Like they spring on the page like effortlessly. I never really have to think about how they come across, because they're their own people, to be honest. And since the beginning, it's been like that for whatever reason. One of my friends, you know, long ago when she read the books, she had told me, my Japanese friend actually, she told me that she believed that Cairo was the heart of the series, and that his, even though you're not in his head, but he's kind of the fulcrum of the whole series, and that the way that he views the world being kind of on the opposite or on the further down the road than the point of view characters, right? In his reconciliation, I guess, with his experiences, that he is like where those characters can be, in a certain sense. Not that he's perfect, but you know what he's been through. And I never really looked at it that way, but that was her read on it, that she felt that Cairo, the captain, was the heart of the whole series. And the more that I thought about it, I kind of agree. And I always knew that Macedon would be, like, the ship would be the fulcrum of the series as well, that all the characters eventually come back to that ship as the heart, really, of it. So in a sense, yeah, maybe it was unconscious, but yeah, he's definitely easy, and Eric, for whatever reason. I think because Eric is just so outside the box. He's a riot to write, and very unique for me as far as characters go. Like I understand him so solidly for whatever reason, even though he's pretty much the furthest personality for me personally, but he's very easy to write, and I completely understand who he is.
That's very cool. That also answers my question, because I definitely think Cairo, to me, kind of does feel like the fulcrum of the series. And as I read, I wondered whether that was something you had in your mind all along, or whether it just kind of, you know, happened that way. And I guess now I know what the answer to that is. Yeah. Okay. So our next question is from, I actually don't know who it's from. So our tech friends, if there is a name attached to this, I will say it at the end. In the previous event, you mentioned that you are writing the 4th book. Will we see in that book the end of the conflict between Earth Hub and the Strivik? And which side will Joss decide to belong to? Is it Iona or Macedon? Yes.
So the kind of the middle fourth book, literally the fourth book is Matryoshka, like in the timeline. And it'll be a short novel though. Like right now, it's only a little bit over 100 manuscript pages. So it'll probably be under 200 or floating around 200 manuscript pages. So that's quite short. It's more like a long novella. And that one's from the point of view of Yuri's brother, Joshua or Jacob. And that kind of explores more of the pirate side of what's going on with the politics, and the alien stuff is involved with that, of course. Like it expands on that stuff, and that will directly influence the fourth book, which is The War Boy. And will the conflict end? Well, I don't want to spoil it too much, but I can probably say, because this happens in the first 20 pages of the book, that something happens that actually puts all of that in jeopardy. And like the peace that has been established so far since the end of War Child, with Joss working as a liaison between the peace-loving factions, which is Cairo and his father, and the kind of the outer colonies and stations that bear the brunt of the war with the Shivakna, they're all on board. And so something happens that puts all of that in jeopardy, and it hinges on Nico's reaction to something. And it's definitely going to explore more of the way that the Shivakna handle things. It really explores that, like, because Joss kind of saw it, and one of the reasons that he decided to stay on Macedon, if people picked up on it, is because he ultimately recognized that the alien way of doing things wasn't his way of doing things. As much as he, admires Nico and the culture and everything, it wasn't ultimately his way of doing things. And so I decided to write from his point of view, because I realized that it will take forward a lot of those things, but also put him in a different position without giving too much away. Like the book will not be like a redux of War Child. It's completely him in a different situation, having to take on a different role that's going to be part of his maturity and development, and also part of the development of his relationship with Nico, and as a microcosm of the relationship between all of the factions involved with the Shivakna and how that goes forward. But it will be tested a lot, and it's digging more into the Shivakna culture, and specifically the assassin priest case, and the way that they generally handle things. And it'll put Nico to the test too, because he's not alien. He was raised alien, but he's not. He's human beneath that. So it'll kind of like put into question all of that. So I'm excited to get that out as well. About 50 to 100 pages of that's written. So maybe a quarter to a third of the book is written, and I have it planned out. But I had to finish Matryoshka first, because where that ends and what goes on in that book logistically influences The War Boy. So I couldn't really write them simultaneously, even though I started doing that.
Okay. Okay, so that question was from Edith. Thank you, Edith. Okay,
Thank
and
you.
the next two questions are from Maya, and they're actually two questions that you already answered in the previous event, but I would love for you to kind of answer them again for anyone who wasn't there. So the first question is, what inspired the alien cultures that you wrote?
I like I said in the earlier thing, because I didn't know obviously what I'd be able to write later on in my career, so I threw everything that I loved growing up into War Child, and not really consciously. It's just that where naturally my interests went. So I researched and read a lot about the military since I was an adolescent, mostly memoirs and things like that, letters from the actual soldiers involved. And I grew up with a love of martial arts. So grew up on Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee movies, took jujitsu when I was little, and it was very much a part of my growing up. And I've always been interested in it, not just strictly as a combat arts, but the philosophy behind it. and I've consistently done research on it, going, as I got older and being fascinated by the development of like traditional kung fu and karate and all that, and kendo and things like that. So I knew that, but I didn't want to like plug stuff in just arbitrarily. And so if I was creating a culture on the alien planet, like a subset of a culture, if they operated in this way as being a kind of a spiritual assassins, that they organize their world, and how would that work basically on a practical basis, and that the whole philosophy of their culture, it's to be a writer, especially when you're world building, you just ask yourself questions all the time. So I would just, what is their philosophy behind it? How does that make them govern? How does that, how do they look on relationships? How does their case system work? We have case systems on Earth, but I really wanted to try and make it very unique to their culture and why it developed, and have a sense of history to it. There's definitely more that I thought out that I actually put in the book. And so in a way, the War Boy will be exploring that. So some of it was like Asian, reading about martial arts and things like that. But the other thing was just, my own interest of trying to develop a realistic culture that's given these elements, given these elements that they are ruled by, the ruling classes by an assassin case, then how does that work practically, and how does that inform the way that they think about things and the way that they go about justice and things like that. So actually, in the Omake, the War Child collection, there's a story that I wrote from Nico's mom's point of view, that shows the actual flashpoint of the war, basically, because she and her husband, Mark Allen, were kind of like involved in how the war even started. And I loved writing that story. Like, I didn't quite realize that she was a jet. Like, she's actually a jet. And the decision she had to make that caused that split and made her and her unit, her company, and her Mark Allen, who was her boyfriend at the time, to split actually away from Earth Hub. And so if you read that collection, you will see actually how the war started and why it started. And obviously then the Strivichnov feature in that, and the way that they, in her burgeoning understanding of their culture, you're kind of seeing that, the way that they handle conflict and justice. And I tried to filter that into War Child too, and especially at the end, when Nico has to do certain things, especially with regard to his brother, and Joss doesn't quite agree with that. So I tried to make it authentic to that. It has to play out and make sense to Nico and the Strivichnov, and if it doesn't make sense to Joss or the reader, then that's okay. And made that a conscious choice too, that if there are some things that they do are inexplicable because they are aliens. And so, and their Joss doesn't have that innate understanding of why they do things necessarily, because he was raised differently.
Okay, super cool. Okay, so the next question from Maya is, did you research trauma of people and children in high conflict areas to write authentically in War Child?
I did research trauma actually through the series. I did a lot with, I researched a lot of war, I should say, initially. So, and from different types of wars too. And like I said, I've read a lot of memoirs and letters that were written by soldiers and their own account, as opposed to history textbooks or whatever. And I think a lot of it was just, I don't know, like I always seemed to, I really felt for those people that I was reading about. And so the trauma part of it, I did research specifically how certain traumas affect boys as opposed to girls. I did research that specifically because, psychologically they can take in things differently. towards Cagebird, the third book, I certainly, by that point, child soldiers were a little bit more on the world stage by 2005 or so. And so I was reading memoirs from the boy soldiers, specifically from Africa. I saw some documentaries about kids in Eastern Europe that were being exploited, that went into that. And, you know, none of the stuff that I've written in the books actually is horrific as what I've read that actually happened to a lot of these kids in similar situations. I mean, there's a movie, the movie that was on Netflix that Carrie Fukunaga did.
The Idris Elba. Idris Elba.
Yeah, Idris Elba. Yeah. That's about.
I also don't remember what it's called. If anyone in the chat remembers, please.
Yeah,
do write
I blanked
it down.
on it, but that came out, you know, recently, fairly recently, like in the last 5 years or so, and I finally worked up the kind of like the gumption to watch it because it is very intense, but it reflects a lot of the research that I had done anyway. And so, and then after that point, because you don't want to get too clinical with it, it's an emotional thing. So you try and access your own experiences, even if it's not directly related to what Joss went through. But I, you know, try and access the emotionality of that in myself, and so, and from what I see around me and stuff like that, and then extrapolate realistically how that would affect somebody. But yeah, it felt really important for me to do the more that I dug into the world, and like deciding that I wanted to explore war from the kind of the most vulnerable point of view, which is the children that are caught up in it, who have zero choice, who aren't orchestrating anything really. I really wanted to explore that, and so yeah, I did do some research for that in books and documentaries and that kind of stuff over years.
Okay. Okay, so a question from Noga, who I know is a very big fan of yours. So she's asking about Eret, and do you know his full backstory, and will we see more of his past? Also, can you tell us something new about him, even a minor trivia thing?
Okay, yes, I do know everything about his past. He was, let's see, what can I say? Well, he made mention, especially in the Omake, like the story between him and Cairo. So that one was fun for me to write, and pretty much wrote itself, obviously with those two guys involved. That both his parents served in the Rim Guardians. His grandmother was also in the military. His parents were killed in a skirmish with the aliens, and so when he was quite young, and so he was raised by his grandmother, who was a vet, like a veteran soldier, but then she died, and so once he was an adolescent, he started to live in the tunnels on his Bascanal rim station where he grew up, and so he was a tunnel kid for, you know, a lot of his adolescence, and that's where he learned a lot of his survival skills and stuff. But to me, he's always been unique in that his sense of self. And I don't know where that came from, like as a character, but he's very sure about himself. Cairo also made mention that, yeah, his gauntlet run, like he knew that the carriers instigate gauntlet runs to kind of test new recruits. And so rather than going the normal route that you saw Joss and Warchild, like he actually went into a recruitment room and all that, like Eric decided to just start a gauntlet run on his own too when he was like 16 to get on the ship. There were jets on his station. He decided to provoke them and then give them the runaround, and that's how he got onto Macedon, because the captain was like, who is this punk? There's also a mention in the story, his first meeting with the captain was, I actually wrote this out, but I didn't like it solidly enough to include it anything published, but it's still headcanon. That it was around Christmas when Macedon at port at Bascanal, and Cairo was by the tree that was on the station and just kind of like hanging by himself. And Eric thought that he was like just a jet. a random jet. And so he went up to him being all with him himself. And wasn't until afterwards he realized that it was the captain that he was hitting on. And then of course that just thrilled him even more. So he started the gauntlet. Yeah, he started the gauntlet run after that to try and impress Cairo. So there's all that backstory. So I hope some of that was something. Oh, his mom's name is Annalise, and his father's name is I have it written down somewhere. Damon.
That's okay.
Damon. Because Damon is Eric's middle name. I don't know if I ever mentioned that in the books. I don't think so. His middle name is Damon, so which is named after his father, and his mother's name is Annalise. So that's something that's not in the books, that I know absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay, so like you mentioned, you recently published a collection of short stories called Omake. So I was wondering, for people who read the War Child and Burn Dive, which are the two books that were translated to Hebrew, which stories in Omake do you think they would find sort of the most interesting, or the most illuminating of those aspects of the story?
Well, I arranged the collection in chronological order, actually, so in timeline wise, and so most of it covers the books until you get to the parts where Yuri's introduced, because he's from Cagebird. But there's the backstory of how Cairo and Eric are as close as they are, because I remember a lot of readers over the years had wondered that, and I kind of had it in my head, but I hadn't written it out, and then I wrote it out, and it made perfect sense to me. But there's a story in there about them, about how all that came about, why Cairo trusts him as much as he does. There's a story in there from, like I mentioned, how the war started, where Enos is the point of view character. There's a story in there about Cairo's youngest brother, which had been published, but I put it in the collection, like what happened to his youngest brother. He doesn't realize he's actually still alive, Paris. And there's a story that I'd written a long time ago about what a holiday would be like on the ship. So it's over Halloween. And Joss is the point of view character, and it kind of also ties into Chris's death, and it wraps that up a little bit, kind of like nicely, because he thinks that he sees Chris's ghost on the ship. And there's a whole discussion, actually in my head, that I had anyway before I wrote the stories, that the Jets and some of the crew believe that there are ghosts of some of the crew on the ship, because the ship is older than the captain who's running it, and it's older than the crew. The captain inherited the ship from the previous captain. He served on Macedon as a pilot, so the ship is quite old, and so there's all these stories that kind of naturally go around a ship like that where there are ghosts, and so I wanted to play into that, and it's over Halloween. So readers might find that fun, and all of the people pop up, like Ryan pops up, Evan pops up, and Joss and everybody pops up. So that one might intrigue people.
Very cool. So I wanted to ask about your writing. I mean, I'm a writer. I'm always curious about these things. I think writers in general, it's really interesting to hear about process. So there's the spectrum of like discovery writer and, planners. Where would you say you fit on that scale? Like, do you plan things in advance a lot, a little, how does it work?
I think I'm kind of in the middle. I don't plan things out like scene by scene, chapter by chapter necessarily, like begin before I start writing anything. But and this is important too for all of the other writers out there who are kind of like still experimenting around, but my process has changed over the years, and that has to do with paying attention to what works for you and what doesn't, and realizing that as you grow as a writer, that your process can change. So you don't have to kind of, draconically adhere to one way of doing things just because you've been doing it that way all the time. I remember that I went through a period where I just wanted to try a different process just to see how it would work. And so, not planning anything, just having the kernel of an idea and starting to write and see if it can come through that way. But I found that that doesn't really help me all that much. I tend to fluid plot is what I call it. I have to know how the book ends. Like I have to know how the book ends. And because I tend to plot on a psychological arc, I also have to know, where I want the character to go psychologically, where I want them to end up. I knew the last scene and the last line of War Child like long before I got there. I knew exactly where it was going to go, that Joss needed to have that moment. And same with Ryan and Burn Dive. I knew psychologically where he had to end up. I knew pretty early on, I think, that it was going to end with him putting himself forward to his friend Cherie in the media and kind of like indicating that this is the step that he's going to take. He's kind of embracing his heritage kind of thing and realizing he can do something with it. And where he would end up with his father, their relationship. I knew that early on. I feel that I need to know that because I gear their development to that, psychologically. So I have to kind of know where it goes. But I fluid plot in that I have to know the mile markers of the story. So the major events. It doesn't mean that I necessarily stick to them all the time because things can change in the process, but I basically need to know the major plot points and the major things that might influence the character. And then as I start to write it, then it gets down nitty gritty. So I like knowing at least one or two scenes ahead. So I don't finish a scene and then I'm like, what happens next? It's like, I need to know where the first, so for example, like the book that I'm plotting now, which is unrelated to War Child, but that, I know basically probably the first 50 to 100 pages of story. And then I know all of the broader mile markers after that, but I have confidence as a writer, and this is where you have to trust yourself. You have to learn to trust yourself, and that's by paying attention to how your process works, that I know that by the time I get to that point, I will know in more detail what happens after that. Like, I know that after I get over that first 50 or 100 pages, I will have figured out the nitty gritty stuff of what happens then. But I tend to need to know, like, immediately, 2 or 3 scenes ahead of wherever I am in the book. And then it tends to be really smooth. Like the 4th novel, Gaslight Dogs, like that was the easiest thing. It was, I tend to write very clean first drafts, so it's laborious in that way, but like it's slow going in that way because my first drafts are very, very clean. Like the words have to be very precise for me on the first go around. But that book, I didn't pause like at all in writing that 4th novel. I remember the process doing it, and it's because by then I had worked out that I need to do it this way. I need to know 2 or 3 scenes ahead. And so I always had something to write. When I sat down, I always knew exactly what I wanted to write. And then inevitably questions come up and new avenues might come up, and then you kind of adjust. So that's why I call it fluid plotting. It's not, concrete plotting. It's fluid, it's malleable.
Okay. Okay. Another question from Noga. So in your books, some characters, even on the good side, quote unquote, do things that are not exactly moral. Do you judge them or do you forgive them?
I try as the creator not to judge them at all or to do anything. Like, I'm more of the witness. So I try to just present, I try to be authentic to who they are as people, most of all. And so if they do stuff that is, not morally aligned with what I would do, it's not my place to judge it. And I think, actors say the same thing, about characters that they play, that it's not up to them to judge it. And I feel very much the same as a writer. And I kind of call it like method writing. Like I don't try and impose anything onto the characters in that way. That they have to act in what's reasonable for them, in given their situation. And if I started to judge them, and want to infiltrate, that might infiltrate even unconsciously, right? Where then suddenly I'm saying something in the prose that isn't meant to be there or shouldn't be there because it's got nothing to do with what's actually going on the page or in the narrative. So, yeah.
Okay. I want to ask, you talked before about the research you did about, and specifically, you know, on child soldiers and how those experiences affect boys in particular. I always found it interesting that so many of your characters are men or boys who were victims of sexual violence, which I think is fairly rare. I don't think I've read a lot of books where that many characters were, you know, had that profile. And I just wondered, you know, how did you do that consciously? Did you want to focus on that? Did it just kind of come out of the world building?
It came out of the world building. I didn't, it's not like I, you know, wanted to deal with these topics. Like, I took a long time to recover after writing Cage Bird because, and I had decided with Cage Bird, and you know, some people it's not their cup of tea, and I completely agree. But I had decided by the time the third one came about that I wanted to be unflinching in it, and that came from reading accounts from those boys, and seeing interviews with them and stuff like that, where you know they had to confront those things in themselves, that they were made to and manipulated to do really horrible things, and how do they reconcile that in themselves, because they're not bad people, they come out of it still adolescents, right? How does recovery work when you know that you've done horrible things and everyone around you knows that you've done horrible things, but you it's because you were compelled or you're manipulated in some way. And so, like I said earlier, there's nothing in those books that actually I did not read actually literally happen in the real world. Down to the grooming, the recruitment by, you see it more in Cage Bird, because by then Falcone had adjusted his method from when he got Cairo as opposed to when he abducted Joss, and then by the time he, you know, basically abducted Yuri, but he, in the third book, but he cajoled him onto it. It was false promises, false impressions. And so he was canny enough to adjust his method and he used another boy to recruit Yuri, which is something that happens, right, in the real world. So all of those incidents, like some of those incidences, I literally pulled from real accounts that I've read. So it was always curious to me when people, I mean, I've had comments, you know, back and forth sometimes from people that said that I was, you know, being too extreme and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, I wish that I was just making it up, you know. I mean, I decided by the time I got to the third book that I definitely did not want to tread in ground that was just like fantasy. You know what I mean? That I was making it up, that it had to be grounded in something real. And the easiest way for me to do that was to actually direct incidences that actually happened, that these boys have talked about in various ways. And then I just kind of adapted that into their stories. And that's what's horrific to me about it, that these things have actually happened, that they continue to happen. There are over 300,000 child soldiers in the world. That number has not abated in the, you know, 20 years, in the almost 20 years since I've written War Child. Like, that was the number when I started doing the research, and it's still the number. It's even more probably. So it was really important to me to be authentic to that. And if I, because of comfort level, or because it wasn't politic, or because it was triggering, if I was to leave that out, I felt that would be inauthentic. So if I was to gloss over any of it, I felt it would be inauthentic to what actually goes on for many of these kids. And the war part is one component, and the other component is the child slave trade that goes on in the world, which is obviously often linked. It's often a part of it, but not necessarily. There doesn't necessarily need to be a war on for that component to be there, but it's certainly there, because obviously children are vulnerable if they become orphans. They get snatched up, And so all of that stuff that's in the books have concrete parallel to what's going on in the real world.
Okay. Okay, so we have just under 5 minutes, and I would like to ask you what is possibly our last question. Who is your favorite character in the War Child universe, and why?
I mean, I have my top 3, which is Cairo, Eret, and Nico, probably.
Wow, not a single one of your protagonists.
No, I mean, I love them, but they're difficult. Like I mean, I have a lot of affection for, they're a lot of fun and they are pretty easy to write. But I think what I love about them is when I pit them against other characters. Like in their own head, it's like, you know, it's fine. But where I find the most like kind of like the energy, or where I guess because it exposes things about them, is when I actually have them in the same room, or they're talking, there's conflict or there's something. So I love writing Nico, but I love writing him with Joss, right? And I love writing Joss, but I love writing him with Nico or with Cairo or with Eric, right? And so it's in that sense. It's like I love writing them side by side with the other characters and seeing what I can pull from them. But I think it's because those, like I said earlier, like I think Cairo and Nico are the 2 sides of the same coin as the heart of the series in a way. Certainly of War Child, the 2, that was pretty purposeful, I guess, is the 2 of them are comparable as mentors for Joss, and that they operate quite differently in a lot of ways, but at the same time, there's some common ground. And so that'll be explored more as well in the War Boy. But yeah, I think those I guess those 6 would be my favorite. Like Yuri's fun, but he's so dark. At the third protagonist is so dark as a character that it's hard to say that I like love writing him. But he is interesting when I put him against Joss, for instance, where, you know, there's that tension that you saw a little bit at the end of actually Cageford, I guess. But you read Cageford, yeah, they have a meeting, and there's a little bit of tension because to Joss, why didn't Yuri run? And then to Yuri, you know, him telling Joss something to kind of counter that is kind of goes against everything that Joss thinks someone should feel. But that was to me like the nuance of it. But yeah, those bunch I really enjoy.
Okay, so I think we have so we have about 1.5 minutes. So I'm gonna wrap this up, and I'm gonna say thank you to everyone who, you know, has been watching us. Thank you for everyone who's been sending questions, and thank you, Corinne. It's been really, really amazing having you here. Is there a project that you're working on right now, or anything like that that you want to like tell people about? For example, I know that you have a Patreon, right?
Yeah, I have a Patreon, and I'm mostly on Twitter, and then Patreon, and then I have a Goodreads page where I update stuff. So if anyone wants to link up with me there, that would be great. I am, like I said, still working on stuff in this universe, so I don't know that it'll ever die. I have so much affection for it, but I definitely, you know, have other worlds that I want to explore, other characters that I'm really, really excited about. I don't want to say anything too yet about it. Like I have a new series that I'm working on that I'm super stoked to really dig into. And you know, I'll always be writing short stories and things like that. So hopefully you'll see more of over in 2021 more stuff. I know I have one story that is coming out in a anthology next year. It was delayed because of COVID and stuff like that, but it'll be coming out next year. And I guess my most recent work was in the dystopia triptych anthologies, 3 anthologies that kind of explore dystopia and different pre-dystopia, dystopia, and post-dystopia. And that's an anthology by John Joseph Adams and Hugh Howey and Christy Gant. And so I wrote 3 stories in each of those timelines that connect, and I'm really proud of those. And I really loved writing them. I think they kind of show where my writing has gone. So all of you writers out there, like, you know, experiment, and I would say, you know, have fun and try out different things. I know my writing's changed over the years, hopefully for the better. Definitely, you know, what I'm writing now in the War Child universe is very much different in tone in a way, and I think the skill level also is different because I've had so much, you know, short story writing and other novel writing as practice. So keep writing and experimenting and paying attention to your own process, and hopefully we'll you know, share a table of contents one day. That would be cool. But thank you everybody for your questions and for being here, and it's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for coming and being our guest of honor, Corinne, in this year of the plague. And thank you to Wani and Barak, who have been helping us with the technical aspect of things. You know, have a wonderful closing event, everyone who's going to that. Have a great night or, you know, afternoon in Canada. Bye.
Bye.